Hello, good morning, everyone, and warm greetings from the Organisers, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, Diplomacy Training Program, and International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs to this official site event of PFII. We would like to thank each one of you for joining us today and would like to extend our warm welcome to each of you. The topic for discussion today is strengthening democracies through recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination as enshrined in the UNDRIP. So if are attending the UNPFII, we have heard a lot of statements made by the Indigenous peoples across the globe that the pervasive lack of recognition, legal formalization, protection, enforcement of self-determination as enshrined in the UNDRIP has placed Indigenous peoples' identity and the world's society at risk from impending climate crisis, increasing injustices, inequity, criminalization, and protracted conflicts and attacks on freedom across the globe. So the question of who is indigenous is debatable and remains the main challenge to the recognition and identification of certain communities as indigenous. So it is very important now then to have established responsible governance systems and democracy that dismantles all this hegemony that we talk about. The governance structures that are conceived in place in law that could provide effective counter if this becomes So if this becomes a popular political agenda and process. So during the last decades, we have witnessed Asian democracy has weakened. And in the recent years, it's rapidly drifting towards centralization and autocracy. So we have also seen that during the pandemic, there are several legislative developments in several countries that have detrimental consequences on the rights of indigenous peoples. It is a strong belief that the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples to self-determination will not only help mitigate the right of historical injustices, but also serve to strengthen weak democracies in the continent. So the discussion today will focus on a few points. This will look at critical examination of implementation of UNDRIP in Asia, looking at achievements, challenges, and opportunities. And also one question will be on the importance of building political mobilization to open up spaces for governance reforms that will ensure self-determination of indigenous peoples. So how do we build those partnerships so that we can sustain this agenda at all levels? So we welcome you to this site event, and we will deliberate on these topics. We have important speakers lined up for today. The first speaker would be Anne Norum, former chair of UNPFII. We have Shankar Limbu from Lahore, Jennifer Lasimbang, national coordinator of JOAS, and we have Wenceslas Fatubun from West Papua. So just some technical reminders before we start the webinar. I would like to request participants to mute yourself unless you are speaking. And also, please input your comments and questions in the Q&A session. And we will also share the videos and resources afterwards. So we are also live on Facebook, just for your information. So to begin with, I would like to request Anne Norum, the former chair of PFII, to take the floor. Welcome, Anne.
Kiitos, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Dear Indigenous sisters and brothers, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to be with you virtually on this side event, Strengthening Democracies in Asia through Recognition of Indigenous Peoples' Right to Self-Determination as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples on behalf of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is very clear on this topic. It states that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination and that in exercising this right, they have right to autonomy and self-government. The declaration does not, however, address any specific arrangements needed to facilitate the organization of autonomies and self-government. However, these rights have been universally recognized by the UN General Assembly. The Article 3 of the Declaration notes that by the virtue of Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Article 4 states that Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy and self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as way of and means for financing their autonomous functions. At our last session, the Permanent Forum committed to facilitating informal online regional dialogues on autonomy and self-governance to support the development of guiding principles for the realization of the rights of Indigenous peoples to autonomy and self-government. In the regional dialogue for Asia, panelists call for political pluralism in order to avoid conflicts and to promote coexistence. Large-scale conflicts and political turmoil in states with minority Indigenous populations can create constraints in functioning autonomous structures. The political vilification of Indigenous peoples also poses a barrier to the process of peace talks and reaching mutual understanding. All these regional dialogues in 7 Indigenous sociocultural regions highlighted the importance of Indigenous representation in decision-making processes and emphasized the principles of free, prior, and informed consent as a crucial in any negotiations with Indigenous peoples and their territories. And yesterday, when we discussed these guidelines, I posed a question to the member states where this process should be considered. Should it be considered at the appropriate level of the General Assembly or the Economic and Social Council with the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples? So the Permanent Forum asked inputs and considerations from the member states on which body is more appropriate to develop these guiding principles for the realization of the rights of Indigenous peoples to autonomy and self-government. And we will continue these discussions with our dialogue with the member states and then reflect the results of the dialogue in our report. Indigenous peoples have globally experienced of discrimination, dispossession, and disempowerment that often comes after colonization. To reclaim our rights, our lands and territories, languages, traditional knowledge and identities, self-government and autonomy is essential. And our moderator posed a question, how can indigenous or right to self-determination could be reached in Asia. And one possible example is to take the example of FILAC, which is a UN body consisting of member states and indigenous peoples to work in the mandated fields with indigenous issues and indigenous rights. And the example of FILAC could be copied also to the Asian circumstances. But for that, we need the recognition from the Asian member states of indigenous peoples in order to develop the idea. While we have made strides in this region, there is still work to be done towards greater regional self-autonomy. And as we continue our struggle for better living conditions and recognition and for fight for rights through dialogue and compromise, we believe that our needs and claims can be solved in ways that give us the recognition that we deserve as indigenous peoples. And we know that there are different models of self-governance and recognition for our right to self-determination in different parts of the world. In some parts, indigenous peoples are formally recognized and cooperate and work with central governments. And unfortunately, in a number of the countries, indigenous peoples exist informally and are not recognized. Every model offers us an opportunity to learn from each other. And we know that there is not just one model we acknowledge that fits for all. And there are common principles and best practices that the Permanent Forum would like to explore in this effort to advance the reality of self-governance, autonomy, and for more indigenous peoples around the world in order to recognize our right to self-determination. Kiitos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your presentation and bringing out the commitment of PFII to the realization of self-determination of indigenous peoples as enshrined in UNDRIP. You've also highlighted several important points that was from the regional dialogue. And we really want to thank you for continuing this discussion of developing the guiding principles on self-determination. So we look forward to that collaboration as well. And also some of the models that we have mentioned that could be reproduced in the context of Asia as well. So we'll look into that, and we'll also seek collaboration in developing such model in the region. We'll move on from here to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Shankar Limbu, our human rights attorney from Lahore, Nepal. So Shankar, I give you the floor for your presentation.
Thank you very much, distinguished member of the Permanent Forum, distinguished delegates, representatives of the member state, indigenous government, indigenous brothers and sisters. Sewaro, greetings in Limbu. So first, I would like to start with the challenges that we have been facing, especially to exercise our right to self-determination in our one land. Let's take an example about Nepal. Nepal was established in the lands of indigenous people. In the name of the unification of the country, indigenous peoples lost their territories, lost their nations, they lost their powers, and the state imposed the caste system similar to racism that qualifies colonizations in the context of indigenous peoples. We lost our political power. We were subjugated, we were marginalized, and also excluded, and we are discriminated systematically. And that is a kind of fate for indigenous peoples. From the formation of the state, I guess this is the case in everywhere that indigenous peoples are facing. And that's not different in Nepal. So we faced like 10 years conflict. In the conflict led by the Maoists, that was an armed conflict, lost like 17,000 people, their life, innocent people lost their life. And then indigenous peoples were massively mobilized or manipulated by the conflicting parties, by the both state and the Maoist. So it was a challenge for indigenous peoples to survive in our own land because of the conflict. And then state and the Maoist party entered into the peace process. And there was a Constituent Assembly to make a new constitution where indigenous peoples were systematically marginalized. Of course, there were indigenous peoples in the Constituent Assembly, but they were not allowed to speak for the indigenous peoples as well. I'd like to raise this point here. When we talk about the participations in the state, when we talk about the participation and inclusion in the context of democracy, what kinds of participations or what kinds of inclusions we are talking to? These kinds of model gives a justice to the indigenous peoples. It gives a free space in decision making, whether they are free to determine their own destiny in this state. That's always the questions that we have to think about it. And then when the Constituent Assembly, it was dissolved, the first Constituent Assembly, the second Constituent Assembly, it was formed, the indigenous peoples were further marginalized and further excluded. So when the new constitutions came, that hardly recognized the indigenous peoples' rights, the right to self-determination and autonomy and self-governance. Though the Nepal is a party to various international instruments, including the UNDRIP and the ILO Convention 169. And still, even after the adoption of the UNDRIP and the ratification of ILO Convention 169, we see day-to-day basis, the indigenous peoples, they have been displaced from their lands. And very recently, in the name of protected areas, in the name of conservation, the Chepang indigenous peoples, their houses were burned down by the army and the Protected Areas Authority. In the name of the development, indigenous peoples' houses are bulldozed, and indigenous peoples' voice are not heard in the development process. So that now, when I say that in the context of Nepal, the colonization, it's based on the racism, based on the caste system that has been changed in the present context, the new kinds of colonization we have been facing in the name of the development, in the name of the conservation, and in the name of the rule of law, because the state makes the law to do the illegal work and to create injustice against the indigenous peoples, though the state claims that they promulgate or they enact the laws for the sake of justice. When indigenous peoples, they go to the court, the state court system, they hardly get the justice in the court system. It's not accessible. So that's the situation. However, there are some opportunities also that I would like to share about it. After the adoption of the UNDRIP, after the entering into the peace process, then indigenous peoples, instead of that taking a street, they started demanding the implementation of UNDRIP and the ILO Convention 169, meaning to say that they want to resolve their issues, the historical injustices, and then historical discrimination in amicable manner, in legal manner. I guess the state is very reluctant to understand about this real situation. Often indigenous peoples are termed as a secessionist when they raise their political issues. And then we formally, I guess, not only the indigenous peoples from Nepal, but the indigenous peoples from the whole world, that we want to resolve these kinds of colonizations in amicable manner through the implementation of UNDRIP. The chairperson of UNPFII clearly articulated while she was sharing about her thought. So let me talk about some opportunities, because when we talk about the challenges, there will be the long list that we cannot finish the list, the injustices against indigenous peoples in 1 or 2 days, because we've been facing ages and ages, eras and era. But there are some opportunities that we have now in the context of Nepal. Though the constitution is discriminatory against the indigenous peoples, the preamble talks about right to the self-governance and autonomy, but it doesn't talk about indigenous peoples' right to self-determination or autonomy or self-government. It has one provision, the provision relating to protected areas in special areas to preserve the indigenous people's culture, identity, and economic development. We've been using these constitutional provisions, and recently, last year, in municipal level, in capital city of Kathmandu, which is the traditional homeland of Newa indigenous peoples, that we were able to establish a special cultural protected areas. I know this is the starting, because when we talk about the customary rights, when we talk about the cultural rights of the indigenous peoples, it has many meanings. It is the first step to exercise the right to self-determination. That's how we understood, I guess, the UNDRIP also in that line as well. And some of the municipalities, let me share with you, like the 4 municipalities of Bardia district, Barbardia municipality, Rajapur municipality, Madhuban municipality, Bachgari municipality, they enacted the act that recognized the customary law and customary institutions of Tharus, which is the political institutions, which is a key factor, a key element to exercise right to self-determination for Tharu indigenous peoples, that has been recognized by passing a law in a municipal level as well. And there are other opportunities also. You know that the right to land, territories, and natural resources, which is a key element for right to self-determination for indigenous, exercising right to self-determination for indigenous peoples, that has not been recognized in legal basis in existing national laws in Nepal. However, as a party to the international law, the Nepal is bound to or obliged to implement the rights over land, territories, and natural resources provision that enshrined in UNDRIP and ILO Convention 169 ensured as well. But that is not being duly recognized. However, we have found we explored some of the areas. The government is giving a high priority to the development, specifically hydro and infrastructure development. And the international financial institutions like World Bank and ADB, European Investment Banks, they are investing money. That money goes to the hydro projects of indigenous peoples' traditional lands and affecting the land, territories, and natural rights of indigenous peoples. We approach to these international financial institutions. Let me share about the one example. Maybe this would be one example for other indigenous friends and indigenous brothers and sisters from the other countries as well. The World Bank has like indigenous inclusive forum for indigenous peoples, IFIP, to they give a voice within the World Bank level. And also the World Bank has like some of the projects that includes the indigenous peoples in the context of Nepal. And also that we can approach and we can, bring the complaint, we're bringing the complaint to the inspection panels and also dispute resolution services and other accountability mechanisms. And that is the one avenues also that we can explore and we can create a kind of environment to recognize indigenous peoples' rights over land, territories, and natural resources in indirect manner. And also that we've been working with national human rights institutions collectively when there is a violation of indigenous peoples' right to self-determination or other rights, collective rights of indigenous peoples. And one of the areas that I would like to share, that is the existing court system, the judiciary. We have brought the writ petitions in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in the case of Bhuvan Baram versus Prime Minister, a directive orders to establish a protected, spatial, autonomous region for the protection of the Baram indigenous identity, their existence, and for their development. The court also says that if this right is not respected, then these people would have like serious consequences. And they are the highly marginalized people, and the state obligation is to protect them, meaning to say that the judicial decision is also in line with to implement the UNDRIP. That is the opportunities I would like to share about it. So how we can mobilize for the right to self-determination? I would like to say that one, we have to, because the UNDRIP and the international law, that means a peaceful instrument. So the indigenous peoples, we don't want a violent measures to exercise our right to self-determination. Though, I mean, when we looked about the injustices, that sometimes maybe the legal measures cannot resolve that kinds of injustices. So, but importantly that we have to follow the legitimate manner, and we have to follow the amicable manner, and that will lead peacefully to resolve the issue. And then we can tell to the states who often turn their ear deaf They don't listen to indigenous peoples. And we can tell in this way that indigenous peoples are a state within the state. And then for the sake of the peace, for the sake of the democracy, for the sake of the justice, then in partnership, we can do that one. That has been directed, and that is the commitment made through the adoption of the UNDRIP, which is the customary international law in accordance with the Professor James and Naya. So I should stop here. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shankar, for your intervention. Thank you also for bringing out the challenges that you have in Nepal, but that is not different from what is there in other countries as well. So the non-inclusion during the whole conceptualization of the Constitution itself, and the exclusion during the Constituent Assembly discussion in the first and the second, I think that's also reflective of what has happened in India as well. So, and also a lot of challenges there from where the conservation model, where colonial and mainstream conservation model which is impacting the rights of the indigenous peoples, and the lens of racism and other lenses which is not benefiting the rights of the indigenous peoples. But also you've also picked up a few opportunities that we can work towards, and some of the developments that are happening in Nepal, and also some models of World Bank or dialogue with national human rights institutions that follows the legitimate and amicable ways of collaboration. I think those are important points that we can pick up from your discussion. Thank you so much, Shankar, for your intervention. I would like to move from here to our next speaker, Jennifer Lasimbang. She's the National Coordinator of Jaringan Orang Asal se Malaysia, JOAS, as we popularly know it. So Jennifer, the floor is yours, and welcome to this discussion.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I have a problem with my earphone, so I hope you can get that okay. So thank you so much, AIPP, for giving us the opportunity. And today I would like to say Kopi Bosian, a very good morning here in New York. To all of you who are tuned in, my fellow speakers and all my friends joining in to listen to our discussion. So today I'm just going to share a little bit about in Malaysia, struggle to self-determination, and some of the cases that we are collectively known as Orang Asal, and we have the Orang Asli in Peninsular Malaysia, and we have the natives of Borneo, Borneo territories, or the Sabah Sarawak territories. We call ourselves natives. So in 2019, we account for about 14% or 4.5 million of the total 33 million population in Malaysia. And there are about 86 different indigenous groups, vast majorities in the territories of Sabah and Sarawak and the island of Borneo. And our friends in Peninsular Malaysia, although they face vastly different legal, political, and economic situation than us here in Sabah and Sarawak, but we also share a lot of commonalities. So where they are, we have Orang Asli and in Peninsular Malaysia, and we have Dayak, Orang Ulu, Sarawak and Anak Negeri in Sabah. So just a quick recap of what are our challenges that we indigenous people in Malaysia face, and the decades of assimilation and colonization actually resulted in loss of many of our indigenous values and knowledge. Although we are very diversely ethnically very diverse, many of us are living in rural areas of Malaysia, and some of us are also found in the cities as part of the labor force. So we generally face with discrimination and some very subtle assimilation programs. The non-recognition of our culture, traditional territories, and of course resource rights, in some cases repression. So of course the situation has rapidly deteriorated in the wake of Malaysia going into fast economic growth and the increasing demand for resources found on our indigenous territories. So result of this and many other factors, for example, environmental degradation, there's loss of biodiversity and resources, which many of indigenous community depend, increase in poverty and breakdown of many of our traditional or indigenous institutions and culture and the knowledge system. So the very important that our traditional institutions are very important for the culture and social fabric of the orang asal, the indigenous people, and we have been systematically marginalized to the point that our indigenous presence and influence has been greatly diminished, even especially at the national context. So, so there are other external threats and influence. For example, many face Islamization and conversion to many major religions. Yeah, so we often asked to forego of our indigenous cultural practices after the conversion, and to lead a so-called new way of life, and they see that the indigenous belief system is spirituality also is going against teaching. So the other one would be the non-governance. For example, many challenges by the orang asal are very silent and unseen threats. Issues are very, very deep-rooted, and some are very internal. For example, even our own indigenous leaders are not very sensitized of our own orang asal issues, and of course there's issue of corruption amongst the orang asal leaders, and not aware. Yeah, even us, the orang asal themselves, are not aware of our rights, and then so we have to look into this as well. So the other one is on racism. Orang asal or the indigenous people in Malaysia, we still have to declare. Sometimes we have to write on our national form the name line. We are known as line, or literally the others. We are not. It's a silent policy. It's like us against them. We are the others. So fractions and divisions within the indigenous communities also can be seen as the establishment of many political parties that claim to represent certain or specific indigenous communities. And also because we also talk about the loss of indigenous languages, yeah. So the identity marker of indigenous people. So right now, the decade of indigenous languages, we hope that we can continue our work in promoting, maintaining, and of course through language. There's a lot of knowledge about indigenous people. So the loss of indigenous language is actually slow, but of course it's not just in Malaysia but around the world. So we should start strong interventions, and I think many of our organizations with support from many international also funds to revitalize and promote our language. So I'm very grateful that late last year I was part of the regional training course on Indigenous self-government and democracy, and this is part of now what reflections and analysis and many discussions that we had at the national level. So part of them is to look at how we can achieve, or what kind of self-determination we can achieve within Malaysia. And as a result of the training, so now AIPP together with our anchor organization, Jaringan Orang Asal Malaysia, or Indigenous Network of Malaysia, we are working on a project under the Promoting Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Asia for Future Peace, Justice and Equality. And we call the whole program as the Indigenous People and Self-Determination in Malaysia. So we are very pleased that we have 3 advisors, Dr. Colin from Center for Orang Asli Concerns, Jenny and Anne from Pakos Trust, and National Coordination Team made up of Hilda, the Secretary General, myself, and Suzanne. And the last research, the 4 research team, we my classmates during the course, and we decided to maintain 5 of us to be part of the whole project that we're gonna do until end of the year. So some of the things that came out through our very long discussion and reflection on how we achieve our self-determination in Malaysia is that we want to continue to exist as distinct people for our generation to come, with our unique identity. And of course, we cannot continue to live our full lives as Indigenous people within a governance structure that does not recognize our inherent distinctiveness and our right to determine our own way of life. So we are also helping to be able to make our own decision, especially on our own education, the languages, or social, cultural, economic, and way of life, and hoping that part of this is to be able to participate in the decision-making process and in the matters that affect our community. And finally, we want to ensure part of the self-determination to ensure that our land, territories, and resources are safeguarded for our future generation, and well, especially not to be left at the others who might not have our best interests at heart. So some of the things that we are looking into, so a couple of them, 5 main activities that we want to achieve and try to achieve is, firstly, of course, the capacity building of our own organizations. Secondly is to start and strengthen the partnership of many universities, NGOs, experts, and even definitely with politicians and the media. So and those who are aligned with our common vision from our community to be part of the Orang Asal movement in Malaysia. And of course, Desan, I think many would agree that media sensitization of indigenous issues is very important, done by our people themselves to inform the media. And one of the main work that we are going to do this year is basically to develop the training materials, localize it, and of course during that time we generate case studies, generate ideas, the common goals, based on our core values, and establish a couple of cultural dialogues to be done at the village level. Okay, what happens? Why is it closed? Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Okay, continue. Sorry. So some of our expected outcomes to revive the traditional governance systems, begin the process of, firstly, of course, it has to come from us, the decolonization process within the minds of Orang Asal, and building a stronger organization with leaders with long-term, and very importantly, they have their strong culture and shared core values. So the the other thing that it is important is the consensus building mechanism in selecting the leaders and representatives. So we also look at how we can, revive the dispute resolution institution, like we have our native court, and strengthen them, and give them more recognition in our, not just in our communities but in the national level. So revival of our Orang Asal roots, setting up more centers for studies in the universities or institutes of higher learning will definitely be very important to generate analysis and documentation of what's happening within the Orang Asal community. And most importantly, I think building the partnership with the government, because that is really critical, that we are able to bring our issues and talk to the highest level government to form. We will start initiate a discussion that would eventually lead to a formation of parliamentary and also state and assembly select committees on Orang Asal. So of course, by the looks of it, it's very huge outcomes, but we are very positive. I think it's time that we move forward from understanding our situation to step up and reach out to more people, and to understand the situation and have better outcomes for the indigenous peoples in Malaysia. So with that, thank you, Kota Dan. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and to all you participants who are listening in. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. The important question being raised there, what kind of self-determination that we want for our peoples. And you've highlighted a lot of the situation that are happening in Malaysia and the efforts that the network of indigenous peoples and their allies are doing at the level. And it's very encouraging to see this targeted project that you are doing with very important outcomes that you have presented. So we wish you all the best for that, and collaboration in that, and how we can together achieve this outcomes that you have highlighted in this presentation. I'll move to the next speaker that on the list, Wenceslas Fataban. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Please do correct me as well. So we welcome you, Wency, and we are very interested in hearing about your experience of self-determination of your peoples in West Papua. The floor is yours, Wency.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Hello, sisters and brothers, indigenous peoples. Again, my name is Wenceslas Fatubun. I'm human rights defender, Papuan anthropologist and filmmaker. But since 2019, I'm working as an advisor for the Papuan People Assembly. Papuan People Assembly is a governmental body set up under the Special Autonomy Law. So the Papuan People Assembly is a cultural representative of indigenous Papuans. So in this time, I take the opportunity to share about the right to self-determination, self-government, and autonomy based on indigenous Papuans' experience in West Papua. So we call West Papua, sometime the next slide. We call West Papua because sometime when I was in several countries, when I introduce myself from Papua, so people think we are from Papua New Guinea, but we are we share island with our brother and sister in Papua New Guinea, but we part of Indonesia, and our brother and sister, they have different, they have independent countries, Papua New Guinea. So I hope all of you are clear about West Papua. The next slide. So basic information about Papua or West Papua. Since 1969, West Papua part of the Indonesian Republic after the Act of Free Choice. Sometime until today still debating the Act of Free Choice or Act of No Choice, because some Papuans political activists think that it is not no choice during the Act of Free Choice, or we call PEPERA, or sometimes people's put on the line of a referendum in Papua, in West Papua. And indigenous Papuans since 1969 fighting also for right of self-determination, and so long time. And 2001, during the negotiate with the central government of Indonesia, so the Indonesian government gave West Papua special autonomy status. So until today, we are under the special autonomy law. So under the special autonomy law in 2004, the Papuan People Assembly was established under the special autonomy law, and government administration put West Papua to two province. We call it Papua Province and West Papua Province. And in these years, House Representative of Indonesia, or we call Dewan Perwakilan Rakyat Republik Indonesia, and the government planned for 3 new provinces in Papua Province. And based on government census, so the population in West Papua Province and Papua Province 4 billions more population in both province in West Papua, and we have 246 indigenous Papuans communities based on indigenous Papuans language, and the population of indigenous Papuans 2 millions population. And so we feel that we are not majority in our land, we are minority in our land. The next slide. And the second about the constellation of perception. So I try to introduction about what the debating about the indigenous Papuans and also West Papua issue under the Indonesian rule. First, a security approach, militarization and surveillance, as well as internal displacement person. So since 1969 until today, in several places, have gunfire between Indonesian military and police with the West Papua Liberation Army, or we call Tentara Nasional Papua Barat, or sometimes the government introduced with the new name, they call Kelompok Kriminal Bersenjata, or Organisasi Papua Merdeka. So until today, now we have 6 regencies still gunfire between TNI, military, Indonesian military and police with the West Papua Liberation Army. And because of that, so ongoing human rights violence, torture, killing, indigenous Papuans from that areas, move to another area for saving their life, so they become internal displacement person or IDPs. So in the town, some Papuans has been arrested or detention because of their fighting for the right to self-determination, or sometimes they're fighting for another's rights. And also indigenous Papuans facing with the marginalization and the population. I already mentioned about the number of indigenous Papuan populations. And another things, environmental destruction in indigenous Papuan territory. For example, around the Freeport mining company. This is one of the biggest mining, gold and copper mining. So now is environmental extraction. And also the political Papuan political aspirations. So is not really feel free to express, to give our opinion, or to sit together, to have a freedom of assembly. So because of under the control by the police, or also by the military. And then since the current president was first time elected, he campaigned for a new approach for Papua called welfare and economic development approach. So because of that, so now many infrastructure projects in the indigenous Papuan territory, and also several economic development projects like Merauke Integrated Food and Energy Estate, where the government give the permission for some palm oil company to take an indigenous Papuan's land for build the palm oil plantations. Next slide. So the main problem of indigenous Papuans now is rampant poverty among indigenous Papuans. Death rate in rice drums. And then second, human rights violence of indigenous Papuans in natural resources area, criminalization, become thieves of our property. And then with this spread environmental damage, and as the potential to be released ecosystem and life support for indigenous Papuans become victim of other people's action. And then the last things, open access, which leads to the orientation of managing on the commodities, not on ecosystem area management. The next slide. And we found that human rights violence that are often experienced by the indigenous Papuans. One's the lack of the participation of indigenous Papuans, lack of recognition, repression, and absence of reconciliation in the policy making scheme. This is a part of related with the regulatory conflict, special autonomy laws between sectoral law, like forestry law with the special autonomy law. Special autonomy law try to promote and protect as well as strengthening indigenous Papuans' right, but because of the another law, become this conflict in the implementation. And then the second violation of the collective rights. The state's right to control is reduced to a sectoral law that legalize the prevention of the right of indigenous and tribal people by the state to the sectoral ministry that organize license politics versus politics of recognitions. This is part of also the Indonesian constitutions. And then violence of individual economic right, economic marginalization in industrial, extractive, and exploitation areas, violation of their right to a good environmental, and then violation of individual civil and political rights, criminalization and repression of the state apparatus. The next slide. The right to control and manage land and the mostly frankly voiced demands by the indigenous Papuans. First, the right to control and maintains land and natural resources in its customary territory or indigenous territory. And then the second, the right to self-regulation according to customary law and customary rules mutual agree upon by indigenous Papuans. And then the right to take care of on self based on the customary management or institutional system. And then right to identify cultural belief system, knowledge system, and indigenous language. And then the last things is also as it becomes general things in West Papua's call for the dialogue. So dialogue for building peace, and West Papua or Papua is a land of peace. So until today's indigenous Papuans as well as several peoples also call for the governments conduct dialogue between Papuans and the government for find the best solutions for indigenous Papuans. So how to strengthening democracy in Asia? I mean in West Papua to recognize recognition of indigenous people's right to self-determinations. So I have 4 points to address in this time. First, the urgency of recognition the right of indigenous peoples in West Papua or in Papua. So recognition, if you compare to the population in indigenous Papuans population in West Papua, based on the government census, so a recognition of the right of indigenous people in West Papua to protect and prevent the systematic marginalization of indigenous Papuans. And second, special autonomy. Special autonomy must be part of recognition of indigenous peoples as a legal subject and the part of a recognition or determination of the right of indigenous Papuans. And then the third, the Papuan People Assembly as a cultural representations institutes established under the special autonomy law must be a space for recognition of indigenous Papuans and reconciliation between indigenous Papuans and the Indonesian state. I mean, we hope that the bodies, the Papuan People Assembly, as a body for reconciliations between indigenous Papuans. So indigenous Papuans give their voice to that body and will negotiate with the government. But until now, we're still working on it. And the last things, government of Indonesia must conduct dialogue with indigenous Papuans representative. I think this is my sharing from West Papuan experience. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Wensi, for your presentation and bringing to the fore the situation of Indigenous peoples in West Papua. And also you have listed clear demands and aspirations of the Indigenous peoples in Papua, including recognition of the West Papuan as Indigenous peoples and special autonomy that you are demanding, and also your Papuan Assembly as a cultural representative and a body for a reconciliation body with the Indonesian government, and also your aspiration of conducting dialogues with the government of Indonesia. Thanks a lot for presenting that. We'll move from here to our next agenda, where I would like to request Patrick to summarize some of the key points that we have from the speakers. So I would like to give the floor to Patrick. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hong Jung, and thank you very much to all of the speakers. I first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm coming from here in Australia, Indigenous peoples of Brisbane and of Sydney. We're very keenly aware in Australia, particularly as we have an election going on at the moment at the national level, of the role of recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to strengthening our democracy. That there's a wide and growing awareness that our democracy will not be full or complete without recognition of the act of colonisation and what was involved for Indigenous peoples of Australia, and without recognition of their rights to self-determination and more formal recognition of their role in the governance of the country overall. So it's been a very fascinating and very rich discussion, and I thank all of the presenters. I think they've really brought home two of the fundamental points of this session, which are that sort of recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights strengthen our democracies, that democracies are strengthened by diversity of voices and identities, and that recognition of that diversity and recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples requires actions by states. We were lucky to get, I think, a very good global overview from Anne of the developments in this area, and a very strong sense that there are models to learn from in different parts of the world that would be very directly relatable and relevant to the situation in Asia. And then we've heard, I think, very different presentations from 4 different countries and their experiences, but there are also great commonalities in those experiences. From Shankar in Nepal, we heard about the history of exclusion and the way that continues and has continued through the adoption of the most recent constitution and the Constituent Assembly. But in Shankar's presentation, I think it's really good to focus on the opportunities that he presented, because I think they have relevance for other people's struggles too. And one of those was that that international standards provide a basis for dialogue, that UNDRIP and ILO 169 and CERD, Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, have provided a dialogue in Nepal, a basis for dialogue between Indigenous peoples and the government. And almost one of the, I think, flowing from that also, that where dialogue can be blocked or progress can seem to be blocked at the national level. Very interesting example of how you can start the process of recognition at the local and municipal levels, and how you can use recognition of customary and cultural rights to assert wider rights to self-determination and recognition. I think they're very interesting strategies. He also highlighted that the possibility to go beyond the sort of nation state in this era and to look at the international financial institutions and the way in which they have, through advocacy, been encouraged, enabled and supported to develop standards around recognition of free, prior and informed consent. So he mentioned in particular the World Bank and their inclusive forum for Indigenous peoples. So that becomes, for many Indigenous peoples who experience displacement and exclusion because of development projects funded through international investment, that might provide an opportunity for advocacy and a channel for building alliances. And I think he emphasized, as other speakers did, the importance of finding allies, including in national human rights institutions. There was also mention of an approach of strategic litigation. So where your courts enable that to happen, then looking for avenues of taking cases through to the highest courts to advance recognition, and using your government's recognition of UNDRIP and of ILO 169 and other international standards to get the courts to recognize those rights at the domestic level. And of course, Shankar also emphasized the importance of community mobilization, and that fed very well, I think, into the presentation from Jennifer Lassenbang in Malaysia, who really took us through a very structured approach and strategy towards community mobilization, to reinvigorating approaches to customary knowledge, traditional knowledge systems, to investing in community organization and capacity building, and to reaching out to build partnerships, and including partnerships at the parliamentary level where there are parliamentarians who can listen, sensitizing the media and building those constituencies of support that are very important to Indigenous peoples, particularly where Indigenous peoples are in a minority and economically and politically excluded. Finally, from Wensi, we heard very, very directly how the denial of the right to self-determination has led to conflict, is currently contributing to concerns about the weakening of democracy in Indonesia itself, and how a different approach to self-determination, recognition of self-determination, may offer the prospect both of strengthening the democracy in one of Asia's largest democracies and most diverse democracies, but may also contribute to ending of the gross human rights violations taking place and contribute to the building of a peaceful Papua and West Papua. So I think there's been a very, very rich session grounded in different people's experiences, and it's been, I am sure I haven't done justice to it in the summary, but I've really appreciated the opportunity to listen to the different voices, and we'll think about how we can feed these lessons into our own work in the diplomacy training program. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for your concise summarization of the key points from the presentation that was made by our excellent speakers. We have some few questions posed by our participants and some comments. I would like to open the floor for questions and answers. I could read the questions as well, but if any of the participants would like to unmute yourself and raise the questions yourself, that is, we would welcome that as well. We have one question from Uncle Ken and Laurie Johnston. Uncle Ken, would you like to take the floor and ask your questions, or would you rather have me read the questions?
I would rather you do it because you do it so much better than I would. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uncle Ken, for posing that question. The first question that we have is on how can we better inform the government and public about Indigenous contributions to the nations and its peoples? And two-part questions from Uncle Ken. The negative impacts of the nation and public due to the poor or negative responses of the government regarding Indigenous rights and opportunities. So we have Shankar, Wensi, and Jennifer. So anyone can take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions, Uncle Ken. It's very important questions that you raised it. A couple of things that I would like to mention here in relation to your responding your questions. One of the important factors for the better communications with the government, it's Indigenous peoples themselves, Indigenous peoples, their own systems, and then Indigenous peoples, they have their one communication system that has to be either maintained or in many cases that has been banished and it has to be revitalized. And then that's why the recognition of Indigenous people's identity and the recognition of Indigenous people's customary institutions and their governing systems and their education systems and their customary justice system, it has to be established from the Indigenous people. So the government can clearly see that the Indigenous peoples are, they governing by themselves. In many area, I mean, many countries, and including Nepal, that Indigenous peoples are being fastly assimilated. So that is one of the challenge, assimilating in the Western political system and assimilating in the political system. There is a high challenge to political co-options. That is the one thing that I would like to say. The second is academic intervention. The academic intervention is very, very important to highlight the Indigenous peoples, or that bringing the Indigenous peoples the good things, and that can contribute to the diversity of the nations, that can contribute to the democracy, and that can contribute not only to the one nation, but the whole world. That should be done academically. I guess the academic work is very important. The people like you and the other, it's very important. And DTP, Patrick is here also, that kinds of program is very, very important to make understand and to make the Indigenous people's voice heard. And the third one that I see that international organizations, and they're playing very important, let's say the UN, but I have seen that there are challenges as well. In the UN country level offices, that they are not very much proactive to tell to the government while they are partnering with the government and national level. So that's their role also very important. And then when we talk about the international level, there are some very important international organizations. Let's say that the co-host of this, co-organizer of this program, IWGIA, or other like the AIPP, these kinds of international organizations that supporting to the Indigenous peoples and bringing the Indigenous peoples' voice in international level, that is very, very important. I think the key thing is also the Indigenous peoples, they should be very instrumentalized, and also they should use about, once again, that I would like to reiterate, like strategic litigations, so that challenging to those, the policies which is against to the Indigenous peoples, and even government doesn't listen, we don't have to care about that one. Then we can mobilize the media and as well. So, and then also there are, when we talk about the right to self-determination, We have to think about other the other options, like let's say the constructive arrangement and treaty between indigenous peoples and the state. Let's say the example of the Waitangi Treaty. There are a number of treaties in Asian countries that was concluded between state and indigenous peoples. For an example, in my own country, I mean, in my community in 1774, we had a treaty between state and the Limbu people. That's why we joined in a nation, so that we are not secessionists. So the state has to understand that. By using our right to self-determination, we unified the nations. That has to be understood. And then also that is that's why indigenous peoples should be, understood differently, not from the colonial perspective. So the state has that colonial perspective. You rightly pointed out in the questions. Thank you very much, Uncle Ken.
Okay, could I say something with reference to my question? It goes much deeper than just simple communications and having people understand. Governments in general and so many of the people in power do not want to understand, no matter what, because they have their own agendas, their own vested interests in denying indigenous peoples their rights and opportunities. So a deeper part of this question is, how do you challenge them? I would like to say force them, but you can't force them. How can you embarrass them? How can you reason with them, negotiate with them, so that they see the things that we're asking for are in their interests also, not just our interests. We're not just complaining. This will have a positive effect on them and their positions and whatever. Okay, I've said enough already. Thank you.
Jennifer and Wency, if you would like to add to that.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, of course, what I feel from Malaysia's context is it's really very important to understand deeply within the indigenous peoples themselves first. So revisiting our roots and retraining the young people to think and we're actually developing the core values and principles for the young people to follow, as well as reflection on us. And as the question of or just the statement from Uncle Ken earlier on, and how do we actually convince the government to think or to recognize what the indigenous people want. And I think one of the very big discussion during the training was how we can improve the whole system well-being of the indigenous people to improving the economy of the country. Once we taken care of our indigenous people the way we want it, the whole country will progress holistically. So we had a lot of also discussion on possibly one of the ways that the government can look at people as not a charity case, but actually some allowed to move, develop, and be part of the whole nation building process, so that it's not always confrontational, but it's actually partnering communities to develop the whole country. So of course we have to do a lot of work. As I mentioned in the presentation, the analysis of what a socio-economic and livelihood of the indigenous people and how we want it. So it's a lot of process, and we have to start looking at going back to our own communities and rebuilding, going back to what are the basic core values and principles of our indigenous communities, so that it is actually acceptable, and we don't have to keep fighting to be who we want to be as indigenous person. Thank you.
May I add some point? Hello?
Yes, please go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you for a good question from Uncle Ken. First of all, based on West Papuan experience, you know, in West Papua, in the one hand, indigenous Papuans, they're fighting for, you know, related with the self-determination, I mean, they're fighting for the political interests, like independent countries. Independent, West Papua has become independent, separate from the Indonesia. So this is why some of indigenous Papuans take the guns and fighting. So becomes a gunfire in the several places in West Papua. On other hand, we try to protect indigenous Papuans' right in West Papua. So when we sit together and negotiate with the government, based on our experience, first we have to separate. In the separate between political interests. I mean, fighting for the independence, and on the other hand, we fighting for protecting indigenous Papuans' right. So we have to separate. When we mix together, so difficult to sit together with the government. This is based on our experience. One said the government tried to close the door, and other said we already come with our standard. Oh, government must like now when we promote for the dialogue between government and indigenous Papuans, the political activists, they already announced that we can sit together and dialogue with the Indonesian government if mediating by the UN or mediating by the third parties. So it is becomes difficult to negotiate. This is one. And then second, based on my experience, I'm a filmmaker. So when I do filming as well as empowering young indigenous Papuans to become filmmakers, for me is one of the good things. We have to empowering young generation, young indigenous peoples, so they can bring the voice from the community with the use media tools like photograph, film, as well as social media to show what kind of their need, what kind of indigenous need, what kind of indigenous want, or what kind of problem we facing. So people and other people will know from our own perspective. Sometimes, you know, manipulate by the government or another people try to manipulate our problem, our situation, especially like our experience with the companies like palm oil companies or mining companies. They try to manipulate us. So best things, we have to empowering young generations. So young generation will bring the community voice for people will listening, learning, or also take experience for our experience or for our voice. I think this is a part of my experience when I did filming and empowering young people, young indigenous Papuans with teaching them to know about the media tools as well as the film. Thank you.
Thank you so much, speakers. We have two more questions. I will read both, and I would like to request the speakers to answer to any part of the question that is relevant to you. So one is, could any identify best or even worst practices for dismantling colonial structures that create conflict, especially within and between indigenous peoples, and what works and what doesn't to end colonial cycles of violence. This was placed by Laurie Johnston. Another question by Ling Hung is self-determination mainly depends on political will and democratization. On the other hand, the capacity of IP themselves. My interest is that community level customary land governance, which create a form of local sovereignty, although it is not legally recognized. Can this be mobilized into a broader scale, and to what extent this can contribute to the struggle of self-determination? So 2 questions, but I would like to give the floor to the speakers to answer any of them. The floor is yours, speakers.
Okay. The 2 questions, which is also which are also quite tough questions that we have been facing day to day. These kinds of questions: what works and what it doesn't work in relation to the exercise of right to self-determination. And I agree that to exercise the right to self-determination, the rights over land, territories, and natural resources is key element where we can exercise our sovereign rights. However, these rights has not been recognized legally in existing legal systems in many countries. But that's not the case in many countries as well. When we see about, when we looked about the national laws, just take an example, in India, the constitution recognized about the indigenous peoples' land territories to some extent. And then there are other examples. Let's take the example of Nepal. Though the existing laws, it does not recognize about the indigenous peoples. But one thing that we have to understand, the law, it doesn't say no as well. So that's why that is the another part that we have to understand. If the law is explicitly saying no, or it's not recognizing, that's the another thing. But it's if it is silent, then we have to, at least in the context of a Nepalese legal system, then we can refer to the UNDRIP and the Convention 169 that is equivalent to the national law in the context of Nepal. So meaning to say that that is the one way then we can assert our rights. On the other hand, that the indigenous people's rights over land, territories, and natural resources, there are many jurisprudences, as we know about it, that this is relating to the pre-existing rights of indigenous peoples. So it's an inherent rights of indigenous peoples. So meaning to say that we have a legal backing to exercise the right to self, the rights over land, territories, and natural resources. But what happens in reality, there are a lot of displacements are happening in the community ground. But at the same time, we have to understand there are lots of resistance also going on in every countries in the community level. Though we are, that's why that we are always advocating for amicable solution for this issue or for these problems or for these challenges. And then that's why looking about the options that I mentioned earlier about the international financial institutions, while they are investing in the indigenous territories, then we can approach to them. That's the one way. And the another hand, let's to share about it. The hydro projects in Nepal. that is mainly being constructed in indigenous peoples areas, indigenous peoples lands, and affecting to the indigenous peoples land territories and natural resources. And most of these projects are under the conflict with indigenous peoples. So the indigenous peoples and the projects, there are conflicts. So the government now thinking in many cases that I would like to share here that the government is asking for the dialogue to the indigenous peoples as well. So meaning to say that the land territories and natural resources is even the existing law is not very much clear in the context of Nepal, but the government in de facto basis, there's no way that it has to talk with the indigenous peoples. So that's the one way that I would like to share about it. Thank you.
Any inputs from Jenny and Wenzi?
Yeah, I think I'll start by I'll just share with Ling Chung. I think the question on capacity of IP and on the customary land governance. So share a little bit of what's happening with us here in Malaysia. Although we do have a strong, we do have our native customary rights section, and we have a native court and land application, alienating land, whether it's a native reserve or a village reserve. The headmen or head women, a lot of women are now appointed or elected, but again, there's still some problem in terms of governance, and we have a lot of cases where there are corruption even within our traditional leaders. So of course we want to empower, we want to recognize, continue to build up the trust to our local community leaders, but at the same time we really need to go back and make sure that they are guided by core values and principles, and that it's a consensus building. It's not like when you're appointed as headman, you have all the power to do whatever you want, especially when it comes to very sensitive issue concerning land. So we really hope that some of the things that we're trying to do during this 1 year project research, that we analyze what we used to have, where there's a consensus building mechanism, and once we make a decision, and so people cannot question the decision or go back whenever there is some conflict, that is all the communities themselves have a voice in deciding, so that when the decision is made through consensus, then everybody's in agreement, and the conflict can be avoided in the future. I think that's some of my contribution and sharing. Thank you.
I think from our experience with the conflict, in West Papuans experience that now we have more than 3 indigenous Papuans organizations. So sometimes when we go for negotiate with the government or sit together and talking about our interest or our problem, difficult because who representing whom. In indigenous Papuans himself, they try to build or set up the umbrella organization called Dewan Adat Papua. But on the other hand, some Papuans try to also set up another indigenous another organization and claiming that organization representing indigenous Papuans. They call lembaga masyarakat adat or lembaga musyawarah adat. So lembaga masyarakat adat and lembaga masyarakat adat becomes recognized by the government, but Dewan Adat Papua not recognized. So this is the example when the the state actors try to playing the game and make us conflict each other, becomes indigenous Papuans becomes conflict in himself. So what we do is we try to go back to our community and try to and strengthening our community with use our own value, cultural value, to first to protect our land, to protect also strengthening our organizations in our community, and then we come out with the claim that we are representing indigenous because we based on the community. We are not based in the recognition of the government. This is the one, and then second, we know that assimilation project in West Papua during the Dutch colony era still used by the Indonesian government in 2000 in 1961, 1971 until 1993 with the Transmigrant project. How they were bring many Indonesians come and take in the indigenous Papuans land, and the good news that now indigenous Papuans, especially the indigenous leaders, they come out and try to organize the community and reclaim their land from the Transmigrant project. Like 2 days ago in Jayapura city, indigenous leaders from Hamadi community reclaim their land from the one of the biggest company, palm oil company in Jayapura city. So it's a good things that now in the indigenous Papuans stand up together and reclaim their land, because without land we cannot claim we are indigenous. Thank you.
Can I have like quick respond to Lori's questions, because I felt that these questions is very important, how to dismantle the colonial structure that creates a conflict between indigenous peoples and a state, and conflict within the indigenous communities. It's very tough questions, Lori, that what you have asked, and thank you for bringing this one. No, we cannot clearly or simply respond to these questions, and also, but based on our experience, what we have had now in Nepal, that we realize that the colonialism, it's not only the external factors is responsible to enter into the indigenous community. The indigenous community themselves also responsible to bring these kinds of colonial things, right? So that we have to dismantle, first of all, our one colonial mindset. Let's take an example about the political parties or political co-options in the context of Nepal. It's being very challenging for us to carry out the indigenous movement as we used to carry out before. So that's the reality we've been facing, because indigenous peoples are divided because in their political lines also. So We have like a policy of inclusions that has been enshrined in the constitutions as a fundamental right. So the indigenous peoples are picked by the political parties, and they don't talk about the indigenous peoples' issues in the state structure, in the decision-making bodies. So that's why the biggest challenge is that whether the inclusion that what we are advocating, whether this works, and how we can do that one. Is it difficult? Is it impossible? I think that's not the case as well. Currently, the local authorities or local municipality, local governments election is going on in Nepal. I have seen in some of the areas, even in the capital city, where the aggressive development is going on in the name of road expansion, in the name of infrastructure development that is impacting to the indigenous people's land territories. And not only that one, that is caused by because of this, the suppressive measures, the forced eviction indigenous peoples are facing. We have to thank to the Supreme Court of Nepal, because the Supreme Court of Nepal issued a very strong judgment against to this aggressive development, saved the 150,000 people to be homeless. And then now in this election time, in some of the areas, irrespective of their political faith or political parties, the indigenous peoples are talking about to cast their votes based on those candidates who can save their land territories and natural resources, who can save their identity. But that is in the local level, right? In a small unit. So that's why that is a kind of an example. I'm not saying this is the best example, but I think it's a good example and good start. I'm afraid that, Lori, I have responded to your questions or not, that I dare to do that thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, speakers. I see one hand raised. We'll have to close this meeting in another 7 minutes. So I would like to request you to be very brief. Floor is yours, Yasu.
Okay, thank you so much, all the panelists, for the excellent presentation. I have a question to our brother from Papua New Guinea. In your presentation, you have said that the government approach is welfare and economic development. And have your government in your country focus on indigenous people's knowledge, skills, and traditional and practices in promotion of mobilizing IPP's rights? And another one is, you have also raised about the environment destruction and violation of human rights and collective rights of indigenous peoples. So how you have been raising the ethic mechanism or strategy in your country and in indigenous peoples movement? Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, Wensi, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for good questions. So first of all, I'm not from Papua New Guinea, but I'm from West Papua. I already is mentioned in the my introductions that since the current Indonesian government, President Joko Widodo, as first elected, becomes Indonesian president, he now announced that he used a new approach for Papua, for West Papua, called economic development approach. So before, during the Suharto era, or we called New Order, still militarization in Papua is one of the biggest approach. so many military operation in several places, like in my village. So some of my village moved to, some of my families moved to Papua New Guinea, cross the border to save their lives, and myself with my parents moved to another village for self our life. So during the Suharto era, but today with the economic development project, so indigenous Papuans also facing difficult and being discriminated. I mean, you know, when we're talking about like related with the FPIC or FPIC principles, so we try to use, but the problem is about the manipulations, like company officer come together with police and met with the indigenous communities and members, and just discuss with them that we just come and discuss about their situation, the indigenous situation, but they give the paper for every member of the indigenous community who participate that meeting to write their name and sign, and these papers they bring back to the city, and they claim that these indigenous Papuans, indigenous community agree for their land taken by the company for build like palm oil plantations or another extractive industry. So this is, I mean, this is a part of the examples what indigenous Papuans facing difficulties and also being discriminated by the state actors, but also by the business actors. So that's mean that you know, when we're talking about human rights violence, so now we not only you know, violated for our like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly or association, but also our lands we facing difficult how to protect our land and how to protect our identity and how to protect our history. I mean like our sacred place where our ancestors live in that place. So it's we're facing difficult with that. But you know, under the special autonomy, we know that we have bodies, like I mentioned, the Papuan People Assemblies. Papuan People Assembly is the cultural representative of indigenous Papuans. So indigenous Papuans from three groups, from the indigenous women, from the communities, indigenous communities, and then from the religious group, elected who they're representing to sit in the Papuan People Assembly to bring their voice. So we have a three group who representing us as indigenous peoples for talking with the government, but also to recommend some local regulation.
It seems we've lost Wency. So since we've reached the end of 2 hours of our discussion, I would like to thank all the speakers for your insights and important key points that you have raised. We, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, DTP and IWGIA are very grateful for your presentations and also the participants for your active participation and also bringing in important comments and questions to the speakers here. So we would like to thank each one of you. We intend to keep this discussion alive, and how do we sustain this discussion is something that we need a collaboration from all of you that are present here. Thank Patrick, me, and colleagues from IWGIA would like to thank each one of you. You have nice rest of the day or night wherever you are. So warm greetings and from all of us here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good